Today we are going to be answering the seemingly simple question of what is an event. Events are one of those concepts that are relatively easy to conjure up in your mind. When I say the word events, there's likely a number of different things that would pop into your head. And there's probably a variety of different things that would pop into your head. So today we're just going to spend time kind of pulling apart and kind of drawing kind of lines as best we can around what are events, what are not events, and then start to think about how they're generally categorized. So take a second, 30 seconds, to write down if you're so inclined, or at least to think about, if you were asked this question on an exam, what is an event? So for me, it's typically one of those things that, like I said, is seemingly easy on the surface, but relatively hard once you really try to draw kind of definitive parameters around it. There is tons of variety within events and event management, making that definitive definition really problematic to real world contexts, right? Are we talking about events of a particular size? Are we talking about events with a particular purpose? Are we talking about regularly scheduled events like a sports season? Are we talking about one-off lifetime moments like getting married or going to a funeral, right? You can start to see, once you think past maybe what immediately came into your mind in terms of what is an event, that this gets relatively complicated, right? There's a lot of breadth and there's a lot of complexity, even within the same type of an event, right? In St. Augustine, for instance, we're really known as a wedding destination. If we think about weddings as events, which they are, there is a ton of variety within what a wedding can look like. From a cultural perspective, from an economic perspective, from a size, from a geography, from a time of the year, a lot of different things there, a lot of different moving pieces, a lot of different variables. Even defining that as an event can be problematic. What we do know is this, that the book distills all this down and says that events are temporary and purposive gatherings of people. Okay? And on the next slide, I'll show you some additional characteristics. But that really does a straightforward, simple job of saying events are temporary, meaning they don't happen in perpetuity. They're different from a restaurant where you can dine out every night or school where you go to class every day, right? They're temporary, meaning the event happens, there's a start, and there's a finish, right? The other main one is that there are purposive gatherings of people, right? So here we are, Flagler College, right? It's definitely a gathering of people, right? There's a lot of people on campus every day. You might go to the dining hall during lunchtime, and sure enough, a group of people. The purposive thing is the operative word there. We want there to be an intentional, defined, pulled out reason for the gathering, right? There's a convocation or which happens here on campus, or there's some kind of a meeting for a student club. Those are events because they have the gathering of people has some definitive purpose. And then they go on to describe events management, of course, as the organization and coordination of the activities required to achieve the objective of events, which is very generic, but also very fitting. And as we can see, tons of space in there to move around. So what are some of the other characteristics? I mentioned temporary in nature. They are gatherings, purposive gatherings of people. Oftentimes they're displays of ritual, right? And we'll think a little bit more about what those rituals are through some of our assignments and the like. But conjure up any image of an event in your mind, whether it's a sporting event or a social event or anything, and likely is you can kind of identify common rituals that take place during those events, right? Sporting events in the U.S., what do we do before the game? We stand up, we say either the Pledge of Allegiance or we sing the Star Spangled Banner, right? During a wedding, right? There's a lot of rituals within a wedding, right? No matter the event that you conjure up in your mind, there's certain things that are on display and can be thought of as rituals. It's really kind of what defines events in a certain sense. And then in some sense, they're unique occurrences, right? So even an annual festival or a sports schedule, right? A professional team's schedule, right? Each one of those individual things is unique from the other one, right? The Orlando Magic play whatever they play now, 72 games a year or something like that, 80 games a year. Each one of those individual games, from an outsider perspective, might be the same, but we know that there's going to be something unique that's going to happen each time, which is, of course, the reason that people keep coming back. So, again, kind of abstract, but it has to be abstract to encompass all that events are, right? So, temporary in nature, gatherings of people, book says purpose of gatherings of people, ritual displays, right? And then, in some sense, they're unique. There's never going to be another second annual XYZ festival, right? There might be a third annual XYZ festival, but it will be unique from the one that came before. So let's dig into these each a little bit. Events are temporary. The question is, what is the range in event duration, right? And this is an interesting one to think about. I think immediately when we think events, we think of one-off, maybe a sports game or like I said, a wedding or a birthday party. It starts at 6 and it's done at 11, right? But we know that actually when we think a little bit more broadly, we think festivals, we think sports tournaments, we think mega events like the Olympics. These actually have quite a longer event duration than just those 3 or 4 hours, right? So while the activity, say the festival lasts 5 days, right? While the activity might be concentrated from 1 o'clock in the afternoon to 11 o'clock at night, each one of those 5 days, we do, from an event management perspective, have to approach that as an event duration that lasts that length of time. We have to worry about what our people are doing, both our staff and employees, but obviously the people who paid to be there, what they're doing kind of in the in-between time. Again, explicit beginning and end, whether it's a few hours or multiple days, they are planned and scheduled, usually, right? So even an event like a flash mob, there has to be some kind of planning and scheduling, right? Because that's what makes it an event and not just a random gathering of people coming and going. The other caveat here, and the other part of this class, is facilities management. And we don't get too much into facilities management, but there's a little caveat here that I like to think about in terms of the temporary nature. And that is that events are temporary, but they often occur at permanent attractions and facilities, right? So whether that be a set of 4 softball fields that we can hold tournaments at, whether that be the Treasury as a wedding venue downtown, both are permanent facilities, but the events themselves are temporary in nature. And while that may seem like who cares, that's an important thing because it matters in terms of, is it possible to maintain the facility at the level that we need to, knowing that it might only get used a certain finite number of times, right? This is the argument, for instance, that always happens when a city or a sports team wants to build a new stadium. Okay, that's great. And for your season, it of course will repay itself in terms of community engagement, economics, and all that stuff. But what then are you going to do it for the other 4 months out of the year, 5 months out of the year? Events are gatherings of people. Think again about what is the range in event size as determined by attendance, right? Now, certainly, depending on the venue, your event can be limited on the maximum end, right? Similarly, You might not want to hold an event at a certain place if you're not able to use it to its capacity, right? We think about this, for instance, often when we think about live performances, right? And to a certain degree, sporting events, but live performances, right? Take the amphitheater here in St. Augustine, they do a really good job of this. There's a certain capacity, I think it's like 2,000 or 2,500 or something like that. That's the total number of tickets that can be sold. So you have band XYZ, and they're coming and they want to play the big venue, and there's 2,500 tickets available, but let's just say half of those sell, only 1,200 sell. From an event management perspective, do we change the venue? Do we cancel it at a certain minimum? What the amphitheater will do, they'll take all the people that got tickets in the upper section, they'll upgrade those tickets to the lower section, and then they'll actually physically cut off that upper section. So if you ever go to a show there, and it's a smaller show, it's like the upper section doesn't even exist, right? Now that's maybe an abstract example, but what it does is it brings people down there, and it makes the capacity of the place match the number of people who are in attendance, right? So size in terms of the number of attendees is going to go a long way, both in where the event takes place, but also what kind of nuanced changes you might need to make. This varies from easy to count to very difficult to estimate. I had a colleague in school at one point who his research was on estimating crowds at large parades. Macy's Day, Thanksgiving Parade, the parades that sports teams do after they win a title. Oftentimes what he found was those numbers were far exaggerated, right? The challenge there is that's super difficult to estimate, right? It's an event, right? It's temporary in nature, purpose of gathering of people. But in that case, there's no ticket sales. There's no other way to easily count people as they come and they go, right? So there's an example of where it's very difficult to estimate. It's easy to estimate. If we go back to our example of the amphitheater, people are scanning tickets. We know exactly how many people are coming through the door. Why is the number of people important, and how does the venue play into that? I kind of already alluded that in my last example. We'll get into events as a business here in a little bit. Number of people in that case, of course, is very important, especially if they're buying tickets or purchasing things during the event. What about type of people? Again, events, much like any other product or service, are going to cater to a certain type or group of people. As event professionals, we have to be very aware of that market relationship, just like we would in any other setting. The last thing here, of course, is new technologies have altered the inherent physical gathering of events through communication technologies. So even pre-COVID, right, we saw a lot of virtual conferences, board meetings that would have otherwise needed physical attendance can now be done in the digital realm. So technology, just like much like technology influences a lot of things, events is one of those things that I'm always real keen on seeing what kind of technologies. And this can be as simple as, right, when I go to a professional football game and I want to go to the bathroom or to the concession stands, what do they have now? They have huge screens everywhere so that I never miss a minute of the action. That's very different than it was 15, 20 years ago, right? Where if I left my seat, I wasn't going to be able to see what was going on until I got back to my seat. So there's a lot of different things that we can think about there. Often displays of ritual. Again, depending on the range and types of events represented, the rituals are going to vary greatly, right? Now, oftentimes, the actual ritual itself, right, is what the event is built around, right? So that second question, can we argue that it is based on the display of ritual? Take marriage, for instance. Marriage is separate from wedding, right? Marriage can exist outside of the wedding as an event. I can go to the courthouse, get a marriage certificate, a judge can say, you do, you're now married. There's no real event around that. The wedding, as an event, has been built around the ritual of getting married, right? That's the best example I can come up with. Again, social needs extend beyond the family unit, leading to events. We'll get into in a couple of weeks the history of events, right? And I think in chapter 1, your book goes into that a little bit. But that's why we have these rituals, these symbols, these artifacts. They're unique occurrences. Of course, I already kind of alluded to this, but their inherent uniqueness because they're temporary. And they happen in different places for different reasons at different times, right? And even, again, like I said, an annual festival, it's not going to be the same each year, right? This makes, of course, planning a challenge, because what is universal, right? Even wedding 1 is going to be different from wedding 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? Now, I would argue that this is one of the benefits of being an event manager and an event planner. No 2 days are ever going to be the same. But if you're a person who likes that routine and that kind of universal nature of the job that you do, that might be more of a challenge. All right, event management and business. Just going to touch on this briefly because there's more that we're going to get into in both of these regards. But in terms of event management, great deal of breadth and complexity in events, right? It's both a skill and an art, and we'll talk more about kind of what that looks like as we go. There are some common labels, right? Even though I've espoused here how no 2 events are the same, right? And they're very complex and there's tons of breadth. What we do know is that over time we've been able to categorize different types of events as a way to kind of find the similarities and pay attention to those as a way to kind of increase our aptitude and our skills, right? Mega events, cultural events, corporate events, sporting events, and on down the line. And later in the semester, we'll get into looking at those each individually. Events are big business, we know. I think your book does a good job of kind of giving the UK example, right? And that's just one example. The difficulty in terms of calculating this overall is that, again, events, there's so much breadth. Where and how are we going to count them and in what ways? And then one of the other things that we'll get into in the next couple of weeks, I think next week even, is the dynamic nature of event management and planning from a professional perspective, right? There's a ton of variety in daily responsibilities. There's a ton of variety in the skills and aptitudes that one needs to develop. Each event is going to demand something different from individuals, right? Even if everything is seemingly going right. There's other things that we'll get into in terms of what makes a good event manager an event manager. All right, so that's all I have for this little kind of what is event management or what are events. In your week 2 module, the content, there's a